But this alienation takes place solely in language, which here appears in its characteristic significance. In the world of ethical order, in law and command, in the actual world and counsel only, language has the essence for its content and is the form of that content. But here it has for its content the form itself, the form which language itself is, and is authoritative as language. It is the power of speech as that which performs what has to be performed. For it is the real existence of the pure self as self. In speech, self-consciousness, qua independent separate individuality, comes as such into its existence, so that it exists for others. Otherwise, the I, this pure I, is non-existent. It is not there. In every other expression, it is immersed in a reality and is in a shape from which it can withdraw itself. It is reflected back into itself from its action, as well as from its physiognomic expression, and dissociates itself from such an imperfect existence in which there is always at once too much as too little, letting it remain lifeless behind. Language, however, contains it in its purity. It alone expresses the I itself. This real existence of the I is, qua real existence, an objectivity which has in it the true nature of the I. The I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. Its manifesting is also at once the externalization and vanishing of this particular I. And as a result, the I remains in its universality. The I that utters itself is heard or perceived. It is an inflection in which it has immediately passed into unity with those for whom it is a real existence and is a universal self-consciousness. That it is perceived or heard means that its real existence dies away. This, its otherness, has been taken back into itself. And its real existence is just this. That is a self-conscious now, as a real existence. It is not a real existence. And through this vanishing, it is a real existence. This vanishing is thus itself, at once, its abiding. It is its own knowing of itself, and its knowing itself as a self that has passed over into another self that has been perceived and is universal. Paragraph 508, a very long paragraph, a lot of stuff going on there, is focused primarily on this issue of language. And I think for those of you who are interested in the philosophy of language or linguistics or other allied fields, you may in fact be both very happy but also rather frustrated with Hegel's treatment here. And I want to say a few things about that before we actually launch into the discussion of the text. One is that Hegel, although he talks quite a bit about language, is not really a philosopher of language as such. He views language as an important component in how human beings interact with each other in the world. In fact, it's inextricable, as we're going to see here. You cannot get away from it. But that said, you're not really seeing him develop something that's exactly the same as everybody else when they're turning specifically to language. Hegel is interested in language primarily as a medium, not just for its own sake, we might say, as we saw the 20th century, both in analytic and continental philosophy, turning to language and paying very close attention to it. The other thing I want to say is, I think if you're going to try to make sense of this text, and you're trying to make sense of Hegel's views, there's two things you want to keep in mind. First of all, remember that this discussion of language is nested in this entire dialectic that we're examining about culture and alienation, but specifically here about the noble and base consciousness and about wealth and state power. So we want to keep all of that in mind as we're going through it. Don't make too much of it. The other is, you're probably going to be unsuccessful if you're trying either to map Hegel onto other thinkers or you're trying to understand Hegel in light of other philosophers of language. So you may want to hold off on any sort of comparative or critical work until you actually see what he is doing here and just focus on that for its own sake. Now, all that said, you notice that I have a sort of triadic structure here, and it's definitely not the triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, so don't read that in. Instead, we have three polarities here, and they're brought together by language, as Hegel's going to talk about. And there is an alienation that has taken place in the previous paragraphs that he refers to. He begins this paragraph by talking about. So the question is, well, what is alienated from what, and how is the alienation actually taking place? And then what do we learn by looking at this? And language is going to turn out to be at the very center of this. So he says this alienation that we are looking at takes place solely in language, in Sprache, right? Which here appears in its characteristic significance. Now, that's kind of an understatement, right? Language doesn't appear in its characteristic significance for Hegel much of the time. He writes in language, he works in language, but he doesn't thematize it all that often. So he says, what is the kind of language that we're looking at here? And he makes a distinction. He says, in the world of ethical order, in law and command, and in the actual world, in counsel only, right? So let's dwell on that for a moment just before we go into looking at what he's going to say about language and form and content. So in the universal ethical order, what we have is law, and Hegel is rightly picking out here that law is not just a matter of thought, not just a matter of reason, not just a matter of some sort of instinct implanted into us, but it has a linguistic or expressive side to it, which means that it's going to be connected with culture in general and particular cultures within which human beings live. Then we have command and counsel. What's the difference between command and counsel? Well, a command, an imperative, says you must do this. You ought to do this. Counsel says this would be a good idea for you to do, but what I'm saying doesn't have any binding force on you. So you may give commands to yourself, or other people may give commands to you if they're entitled to command you. You may give commands to others. Shine my shoes, you know. You say that to the person who is charged with keeping your clothes clean, if you have any such person, right? Probably telling yourself, hey, it's time to shine our shoes. Let's get on with it, right? That's the way I am. Counsel is, well, you know, it'd be prudent for you to do this, but you don't have to because it's up to you. So you see the difference between those. And these are all linguistic, right? You don't give commands to a person outside of some language. Even when we're talking about computers, right? You give a command in a computer language, and you can say, well, that's just a bunch of, numeric or logical operations arranged in certain ways. Sure, but from our perspective, it's a language. So these are all linguistic. Now, what does this have to do with what's going on in this alienation of the individual from the ethical order? He says, language in law, command, and in counsel, language has the essence for its content. Right? So Hegel is playing off of this, form and content distinction. Language is a form, right? You can express in a number of different ways the same content. And if we use, Ferdinand de Saussure, the great French linguist, who knew a lot of languages, and by the way suggested that if you want to be a linguist, you need to actually study languages, not just study a language and then philosophize on that basis, but do some good comparative work. He says, look, you've got something like a sign, a word, and then there's something that it signifies. Hegel is operating with something like this in mind. Here, the sign would be, or the signifier would be the form. And that could be, in French, arbre, could be in English, tree, could be in German, Baum, could be whatever we want it to be, right? And then there's the same content, that tree over there, the thing that we knock our hand against, right? And there's lots of things that we can refer to like that, where we can say, aha, the book, right? We get into the realm of metaphor and analogy and metonymy when we say, aha, Hegel, right? Now it says Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit on the book, but Hegel himself is not contained in here. But we could say that Hegel's mind in a certain way, or Hegel's thoughts, Now, it's not Hegel's mind like everything that he has in his brain at one single point in time, of course, because it's this long, long discursive thing that takes a very long path to that we have to traverse in order to understand what he's saying. And frankly, I'm not sure that we even totally understand when we're done with it. And there's a whole conversation to be had about that. But you notice we're doing that in language. And you say, well, what is the form? What is the content? And how does language hook up with stuff like this and stuff like this? Words are coming out of my mouth, going into this video camera. You're hearing it on your computer. We could say, isn't that mysterious? What the hell is going on there? How is meaning being conveyed? And again, Hegel is not going into some huge philosophy of language or linguistics, making sense of all of that, showing its anthropological, dimensions or anything. He's focused here on a few things. But he is saying some things that are very profound and very interesting. So he says, language has the essence for its content. We saw that already at the beginning in sense certainty, where Hegel is going to refer us back to a little bit later in this paragraph, isn't he? In sense certainty, we found that language allowed us to say things like here, now, there, then. And then in the further sections, right, the section on perception, right, we found that language could be used to talk about the thing and its properties. And each one of these words could be used to peg a sort of essence that we could put there and there and there and there. And this is a really fundamental metaphysical issue that Hegel's dealing with. Now we're interested in it primarily in terms of social dynamics and meaning. So he goes on and he says, here we go, language has the essence for its content and is the form of that content. That's the interesting thing about language. Language can be self-referential. It is the form of that content, right? And then he says, here it has for its content the form itself. There is recursivity or reflexivity here. So language, this is a very important point. Language is part of what allows spirit or, being in and for itself, human being, to have that connection to itself, to be able to, in this case, he's very interested in this, name itself. Not name itself like me saying Gregory Sadler, right? Or you naming me. Hey, Dr. Sadler, or my mom, when I was little, Gregory Brian Sadler. But my capacity to say I, and for you to understand this I over here as not being the same I that you say, but in a certain way also being that same I, essentially. We're naming an essence. But the content is also becoming the form here. So he goes on and he says, for the form which language itself is, and it's authoritative as language. And here he talks about the power of speech. And Miller chooses a word here to translate ausführen and ausführt, right? Ausgeführen, really, actually, I think in the German text, and ausführt. He talks in terms of performance, and I like that because in 20th century English-speaking philosophy of language, we make a distinction sometimes between performative and other sorts of statements. So, for example, when I say, I promise that I will X, Y, Z, that I promise is a performative. I am thereby making a promise by saying the words I promise. Or when somebody, to use, I think it's Austin's example, I pronounce you husband and wife. I pronounce you husband and wife. The minister or rabbi or priest or whatever it is, the officiant who's doing that, could be justice of the peace, is carrying something out, is doing something with language, is acting through language. Here's where it's really interesting. Hegel sees these sorts of things like law, command, and counsel as themselves performative. They're not descriptive. You can't break a law down into simply a description. And we might say, they're really more imperative. Well, it can be imperative and performative at the same time because these are not mutually exclusive categories. So there's a lot interesting going on here that Hegel just doesn't really work with, but I think the translation is particularly felicitous at this point in the word choice. Ausführen literally means sort of to lead out, right? To work out, to bring out of something, to perform, right? So he goes on and he says, it's the power of speech is that which performs what has to be performed. And then he says, it's the real existence of the pure self as self. So we don't have a pure self on its own, disengaged from the world. This is typical Hegel, right? We don't have a pure self apart from its instantiation. We don't have a pure self apart from its action. It has to be made actual, real, wirklich. This is a constant dynamic in Hegel. And now language is being picked out here as one mode of that Wirklichkeit, of that actuality, of that gegenständliche existence, that objective existence, right? So he goes on and he says, it's the real existence of the pure self is self. In speech, self-consciousness, qua independent, separate individuality, comes into existence so that it exists for others. And this is a very interesting thing to say, right? In speech, in language, in actually discoursing back and forth, we are able to be an independent I, a independent self-conscious existence, but only in relation to others. And we saw this, already involved in the self-consciousness section. There is no self-consciousness entirely apart from other self-consciousnesses. And culture, if you think about it, is made up largely of these others, each of whom could be in this position, right? So there's a reciprocity and dynamic going on there. But this is very important. He's saying that language here is what is allowing this. So he says, otherwise, if there isn't the others, if you're just all by yourself, if you're engaging in what later analytic philosophers would talk about as a private language, there was a big discussion, ultimately stemming from Wittgenstein. Is it possible to have a purely private language? The answer is no. Otherwise, this pure I is non-existent. It is not there. In every other expression, it is immersed in a reality and is a shape from which it can withdraw itself, he says. It is reflected back into itself from its action, as well as its physiognomic expression, and dissociates itself from such an imperfect existence, in which there is always at once too much as too little, letting it remain lifeless behind. So he's contrasting language here to our action and to what we talked about in the physiognomy, the way in which we appear, right? Language has a little bit more arbitrariness to it. Language is a little bit more of a code that is independent. Language also has a greater capacity for self-reference, for, as Hegel is putting it here in a somewhat groping way, for having its content become its very form. So Hegel is not actually comparing language here to action and physiognomic expression, or phrenological expression too, right? Think back to that section. He's saying that language is doing something a bit different. So how do we parse this out? What does he say? He says, language contains it in its purity. What's the it? He's going to tell us here. Language alone expresses the I itself. So the I, it's being expressed in language to who? Maybe back to oneself, maybe to the powers that be, maybe to the others, and the others are doing the same thing. But in a certain way, the I never truly leaves language. Language is not just a medium for communicating the I. Language is where the I can actually be an I. This is a very important point. A little bit more pregnant, I think, than Hegel takes it as being in his philosophy of mind or philosophy of spirit. Because he's showing us right here that he understands language is different than these other, what we might call more motivated, if we're using linguistic categories, more motivated forms of expression, right? So he goes on and he says, this real existence of the I is, qua real existence, an objectivity, which has in it the true nature of the I. Now, that's a big claim. The true nature of the I. It does not lie in mind dissociated from language. It lies in mind connected with others through language. So he says, the I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. Now we're going to see alienation show up again, aren't we? Looked like language could get us out of alienation and Fremdung, right? We can connect everything together in a web of language. Everything can be expressed in language. And yet one of the most important functions of language, the I, or the you, or the he, what we might call these pronomial sliders, that's one of the ways they're talked about in linguistics. This is something that was very much the object of interest for 20th century French and German, and also certain other linguistic thinkers. What is the nature of this I that talks about itself? That I can use it and you can use it, and it's not the same I in both cases, but yet the I is the same, isn't it? This sounds very paradoxical. Well, this is where alienation takes another form, doesn't it? So he goes on and he says, this is both a universal I and a particular I, and he says, its manifesting is also at once the externalization and vanishing. Externalization and vanishing of this particular I. And as a result, the I remains in its universality. So whenever I express my own I, and I'm trying to be this individual here, don't categorize me, man. I'm who I am. And, you only get to know me by spending time with me. There's a vanishing to that. As a matter of fact, not just for the others, even for myself. If I withdraw from not just the others, but the universal I lose hold on my own I. Isn't that a fascinating idea? What does this have to do, thinking back to what we've been talking about? Hegel's not mentioning this here in this paragraph. But remember, the noble and the base consciousness. What was the noble consciousness doing? It was identifying its I with the I of the universal order, and thereby gaining some praise or some status from the others. That was a strategy that was being pursued. Not just an ethical strategy, but a metaphysical strategy. Strategy about self-identity. The same thing was going on with the base self-consciousness that was going to hold on to its own I and say, kind of screw the system, right? I'll go along with it so far as I have to, but if I can get something over on it, if I can retain something back, that's what I'm going to do. So he says, the I that utters itself is heard or perceived. And this is interesting. It is an infection in which it has immediately passed into unity with those for whom it is a real existence. Who is that? These others, and is a universal self-consciousness. That it is perceived or heard means its real existence dies away. When I say I, when I point at myself, you are seeing something here, but I'm losing hold on that, and so are you. And we're eventually just perceiving this. And you are the others for me, I am the other for you. So he goes on and he says, this otherness has been taken back into itself, and its real existence is just this. And now notice we're going back to the categories way at the beginning of sense certainty, right? That as a self-conscious now, as a real existence, it is not a real existence, and through this vanishing, it is a real existence. We see the dialectic of the here and now being played out once again. Language had come up at that point in Hegel's phenomenology. So very clearly we've got something going on here that mimics what was taking place back then, only we're doing it at a much higher level. We've built up a lot more conceptual apparatus, so we're not just bewildered and then have to move on to things and their properties. We can launch back into it. And Hegel's going to go on and bring this to a end by saying,
This vanishing is thus itself at once its abiding, is its own knowing of itself, and its knowing itself as a self that has passed over into another self that has been perceived and is universal. What is he talking about there at the end of this passage? He's talking about realizing that we can never be truly what we think we want to be as ethical agents entirely on our own, disconnected from the ethical order, disconnected from the others, because we never do disconnect from them entirely. Every, not just action, but everything that we say about our actions, everything that we do performatively is, you might say, up for grabs. And it's only by somehow coming to terms with that we're going to be able to make progress. This may not be a possibility for some people. They may have boxed themselves into a corner where they cannot grasp what it is that language is permitting and requiring here. If we want to use some, strange language a little bit here. So, what are we left with? Again, we don't get a full theory of language here, so we shouldn't try to read all of that into Hegel, but we are getting is some very interesting reflections on the role that language does play in allowing there to be an I in the first place, in the relation between self and other, in the relationship between individual and universal, all of this comprised within the ethical order.